Hi, I'm Ryotash. In 1729, the elite of Ireland had gotten a proposal sent by an anonymous writer. This wasn't uncommon at the time. Ireland was in dire straits, and there were many people, usually wealthy and privileged people, sending them schemes on how to deal with the poor of Ireland that had been flooding the capital. This was what they expected when they picked up this proposal and read it. It was humbly titled, "A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden on Their Parents or Country and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public." Quite a mouthful, but we-ball. It was well written. It painted a painful condition of the poor. He talks about mothers in rags dragging their half a dozen children behind them while they go to beg. This sounds like a man trying to save his country. Just like all good schemes, the proposer introduces his math. He calculates the amount of people in the country, or better yet, the amount of couples that are capable of producing children in the country. Then he simply says, "A young healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or ragoust." The reader pauses for a second, then reads it again and again and again. This man wasn't proposing a charity or a work scheme. He was proposing that they literally breed people like cattle and consume their children. This is the story of a modest proposal, considered arguably the darkest satirical essay in the English language. Now, even though the author was anonymous in 1729, in the big 2026, we know that it was written by Jonathan Swift. You may already know him from A Tale of a Tub if you're a depressed English literature student, or the hit Jack Black comedy adventure movie Gulliver's Travels. Say it again, y'all. Swift was Anglo-Irish, meaning he was born in Ireland but belonged to the privileged Protestant ruling class. In fact, for most of his life, the dude didn't even want to be in Ireland. He wanted to get into politics. Surely he wouldn't do something extremely stupid and ruin his career. Oh, what's that? He made fun of the Queen of England? Okay. You gotta go and sorry. Yeah, so he had to go back to Ireland and become a priest. A pretty important one, as the dude was the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, Ireland. Now, even though he spent a majority of his life in Britain, he still cared for the Irish people who were getting exploited by the British at the time. In fact, this wasn't even his first time writing to the government with a proposal. He had written dozens of proposals, the most prominent being the ones he wrote between 1724 and 1725, where he wrote 7 pamphlets called the Drapier's Papers, which single-handedly prevented England from flooding Ireland with low-quality copper coins, which made him a local hero. So, you might be wondering why a man that was a priest, a scholar, and a hero wrote a proposal to the rich and powerful to eat poor children. Who am I kidding? We live in 2026. A rich and respected figure being an evil cannibal murderer is basically everyday news. But notice what I said in the intro. I said darkest satirical essay, didn't I? To our genuine surprise, Jonathan Swift was not a sociopath. He was just an exhausted and angry man, sick and tired of watching his country bleed. You gotta realize that this dude has been writing these pamphlets for years, basically begging the British government to fix the Irish economy, and other than a few occasions, he was ignored every single time. So one day he just kinda snapped and wrote an essay literally telling them to kill the poor quickly instead of killing them slowly with their incompetence. But it wasn't just his personal frustration that led to this essay either. It was the fact that Ireland was in the middle of a famine. Now I know that as soon as I mentioned Ireland and famine together in a sentence, you all immediately thought about the one about the blighted potatoes. Don't worry, I thought so too. But that one didn't take place until a century later in the 1840s. The famine that Swift was talking about happened in the 1720s. See, in 1729, Ireland had suffered 3 consecutive years of terrible harvests, along with winters that looked like they were ripped right out of an episode of Game of Thrones. Fair to say, they were cooked. Obviously, this affected people in the countryside of Ireland as they were the farmers, so thousands of starving rural farmers and their families flooded into the capital, Dublin, to beg. And this was an immediate problem for the rich of Ireland who lived in Dublin. This is why the essay's first paragraph is all about the streets being filled with starving mothers with 5 or 6 children, because this is what he saw if he just peeked out of his window. But the most horrifying part about this whole situation is that, in my opinion, this disaster was partially man-made. See, there was a huge divide between the two types of Christians at the time. the Catholics and the Protestants. The Catholics believed that the Pope is the head of the church on earth, and they prayed to the saints as well as God himself. Protestants, on the other hand, believe that the Bible is the only thing that matters and that they should pray only directly to God. Now, I'm really oversimplifying this, but this is the basic difference you need to know for this story, okay? At the time Swift was writing, Ireland's population was roughly 80% Catholic. However, nearly 100% of the political power, wealth, and land were controlled by the Protestant elite, the 20%. These guys were also backed by the British Crown, who were also Protestant at the time. And even though Ireland was a British territory at the time, England basically viewed the Catholic Ireland as enemies that needed to be quelled. And the Protestant elite was specifically present to act as the political version of hall monitors of Ireland. Most of the landlords at the time were also part of this class, and since they didn't view their Catholic tenants as countrymen, they treated them like they were dogs. And they were not subtle about it either. There were some laws imposed on Irish Catholics called the penal laws. These laws restricted Catholics from any sort of political power, education, and most importantly for this story, buying land. And if, say, you were a Catholic landowner and you died, you were forced to divide up your land between all your sons. This meant that over a few generations, there was basically no land to go around, as they were all simply too tiny to be used. However, if your eldest just happened to convert to a Protestant, he would inherit the whole estate. This law had its intended effect, and the majority of the Catholics lost their land and had to rent plots from Protestant landowners. So these landowners became quite wealthy from the poor Irish Catholics. Ironic, because most of these guys didn't even live in Ireland. They lived in London. They just hired people to extract rent from the peasants. And since these dudes were living in London, they were not spending any money on the local markets, which means there was a total of zero reinvestments going on. They were literally siphoning out money from the country. It doesn't take a genius to figure out why this is not exactly the best situation. They were effectively bleeding out Ireland's economy. This is where Jonathan Swift comes in. He had a very complicated relationship with this issue. He was not a Catholic peasant, quite the opposite actually. He was the priest of a Protestant church, and quite a wealthy one as well. This is where you expect me to say that Swift, despite being a Protestant, was sympathetic towards the Catholics, right?
It's false. No way. No. We got you.
He hated their guts just as much as all the other Protestants that were living during his day. He viewed them as a religious threat and even supported some of the penal laws at first. He didn't just suddenly pull a daredevil and become a champion of the Catholic faith. He wrote this because the condition of the Irish poor was so bad that he literally had to put aside his prejudices. To rub salt in the wound, some of these Protestants became something called projectors. Projectors were rich economists and bureaucrats who believed that every problem could be solved with a new scheme. So they would write to the public offices and flood them with pamphlets filled with out-of-touch proposals. Reading some of them is quite entertaining actually, because they would treat the Irish people like they were numbers on a page, just statistics to be moved around here and there. Now, Jonathan Swift was technically part of the projectors too, but the thing is, he actually lived in Ireland. Yeah, most of the projectors who wrote to Irish public offices were not even in Ireland. They were in London sipping tea in their lavish houses. These projectors emerged during the Age of Enlightenment. This was an era that was obsessed with science and logic and reason and all that good stuff. But since science was God, human beings were simply demographic data. Like, in all seriousness, some of these proposals were completely devoid of human empathy. Like, they would literally treat them like they were farm animals that could be neatly put into schemes. They would use their flawless language to pitch horrible ideas, sometimes literal atrocities. Now, I said all this because I feel like it was important to understand the actual essay itself. Otherwise, it would be like Anton from No Country for Old Men tried to write an essay or something. With all that out of the way, let's begin. Jonathan Swift writes as an unnamed character in this essay. I'm going to simply call him the Proposer. The Proposer is essentially a parody of the average projector. But remember, Swift is not the one who is writing this. The difference between Swift and the Proposer may be small right now, but it will become much more apparent later. Now, considering the content of this essay, it begins shockingly normal. In the first paragraph, Swift tries to appeal to emotion. Remember, his readers are not the poor Irish, it's the aristocratic Protestants. Swift wants them to shake their heads and be like, yes, the poverty in Dublin is really a tragedy, before they sip their tea exported from China or something, I don't know. What I want you to notice is how vivid the imagery is. The picture of a woman leading her 4 children through the streets on her way to beg. The proposer says that these kids only have 3 options, and that is to either turn into thieves, sell themselves to the Barbados, or leave the country to fight for the pretender. This pretender being James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of James II, the Catholic king that got overthrown in London by the Protestants in what was later referred to as the Glorious Revolution. The reason they call him the pretender is because he claimed the right to the British throne. He and his followers were Catholic, and they spent literal decades preparing to overthrow the Protestants and take his crown back. Because the Irish were getting crushed by the penal laws, most people saw the pretender as their only salvation. Their thought process was that if he was placed back on the throne, then Catholic rights would be restored, which meant that many desperate young Irishmen fled to the country to join the armies of Catholic nations like France because they were forbidden from serving in the British military. The reason Swift brought the pretender up is because the wealthy Protestants were terrified of the possibility of a Catholic king, let alone the son of the king they overthrew, was once again going to rise to power. Because if he did, the Protestants were going to get their heads lopped off Louis XVI style. Swift is not only playing on the sympathy of the reader, but also practicality. This is also where Swift completely shifts into his persona of the proposer with this line. I think it is agreed by all parties that this prodigious number of children in the arms, or on the backs, or at the heels of their mothers, and frequently of their fathers, is in the present deplorable state of the kingdom a very great additional grievance. This is a classic tactic used in politics. By saying we all agree, he makes the reader feel like if they don't agree, they are the odd one out. But notice how the dehumanization begins. In the first paragraph, the children were called helpless infants, but now they are called an additional grievance, like they were an unpaid debt or something. He tells us there is a cheap and easy fix to this problem, a solution that is so good that the proposer thinks that his statue would be set up in a town square as the preserver of the nation. Because not only does his scheme help the homeless, but also it can be applied to the working class as well, because even they can barely support their children anyway. The proposer says that he has reviewed the schemes of other projectors and found them to be not up to the mark. But he has done the math to back up his claims. He then says this: it is true a child just dropped from its dam may be supported by her milk for a solar year with little other nourishment, at most not above the value of 2 shillings, which the mother may certainly get, or the value in scraps by her lawful occupation of begging. See, back in the day, the phrase dropped from its dam was specifically used in the birthing of livestock like sheep or cows, not for human children. And just like cattle, he goes on to calculate the cost of keeping a human infant alive for 12 months. Implying that it's not exactly worth it. Then saying that with his scheme, these children would not only contribute to the feeding, but partly to the clothing of many thousands.
What do you mean by that?
He also says that something you will find quite ironic in a few minutes, and that is that his scheme would stop mothers from committing infanticide out of desperation, that his plan would stop people from sacrificing their poor innocent babes, which would move tears of pity in even the most savage and inhuman breast. Finally, the proposer gets to the numbers. The number of souls in this kingdom being usually reckoned 1.5 million. Of these, I calculate there may be about 200,000 couple whose wives are breeders, from which number I subtract 30,000 couple who are able to maintain their own children, although I apprehend there cannot be so many under the present distresses of the kingdom. But this being granted, there will remain 170,000 breeders. I again subtract 50,000 for those women who miscarry or whose children die by accident or disease within the year. There only remain 120,000 children of poor parents annually born. Now you might be asking, Rio, where is the proposer getting all these numbers from? I mean, that's a good question, right? You really wish you had the answer for that, right? Anyway, in the nicest possible way, the proposer is pulling these numbers out of his buttocks. They are not real.
We made this one up. It's fiction. We made up this one.
He does this so the proposal sounds like a peer-reviewed study instead of something he made up in 5 minutes. Also notice how the proposer dismisses a tragedy in this line. He acknowledges that Ireland is collapsing, but that's not important enough for him to put in his essay, relegating it to a tangent in the brackets instead. To the proposer, this is not a tragedy, just something that would slightly skew with his excellent data. He then maps out the career path of a child born in families such as these. He dismisses the idea of them actually getting honest work because the economic system imposed by the British was so garbage there was literally no point in even considering it. So instead, he evaluates a child's worth based on their ability to steal. I mean, he literally refers to the act of thievery as an art. Then he says that he's assured by merchants that a child before 12 years of age isn't a saleable commodity, referring to slavery, or at least it's using the language of the slave trade. He says that the food and clothes it takes to raise a child for that long is more than the price of the child anyway. This is when we get this absolute gem of a line. I shall now therefore humbly propose my own thoughts, which I hope will not be liable to the least objection. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child well nursed is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked or boiled. And I will make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ghost. You notice the first sentence in this atrocity of a paragraph? The dude says that he will not be liable to the least objection, as in, you are stupid for even questioning his idea. But also notice something, the proposer doesn't just say that they should eat the children, he specifically points out high-end aristocratic styles of cooking like fricassee or a ghost. This is not just done for shock value, although that is definitely a part of it. He's specifically tailoring these insults to his wealthy clients. He continues on the essay like nothing happened to some of the economics he missed. He says that the ratio of breeders should be 1 male to 4 females, the exact ratio that a farmer at that time would use to breed his sheep. He then requests the mother to feed their infants properly during the last month before a year passes so they're plump and ready for the cooking. Then he proceeds to give a seasoning recipe for a child sandwich, turning this into Satan's favorite cookbook. The proposer says that he's sure that the baby meat will be somewhat expensive, a delicacy strictly reserved for the 1%. Then he writes this. And therefore very proper of landlords who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. Now Swift isn't saying that landlords are literally eating the parents. But you remember how I told you the landlords being in London, right, and having no sympathy for their countrymen? Swift is saying that since the landlords have taken every single cent from the parents, the only thing that they have left to take from them are their children. The proposer says that 3 out of the 4 children born in Ireland are papists, a derogatory word for Catholics. He says that one of the primary benefits of implementing his scheme is lessening the number of Catholics in Ireland. Furthermore, the landlord will get good food and the mother will have a little money for herself, suggesting that with the next child, she can save up even more. Now you might be thinking, Rio, surely we have gone past the most disgusting part of this essay, right? I mean, what's worse than eating babies? You remember this line? Do you see the second half of this line? Yeah, those who are more thrifty, as I must confess the times require, may flay the carcass, the skin of which, artificially dressed, will make admirable gloves for the ladies and summer boots for fine gentlemen. The proposer suggests that they shouldn't just eat the children but also wear their skin as luxury fashion. He says that we need slaughterhouses appointed for this purpose, and that too in the most convenient parts so that human meat and leather are extremely accessible and they are hot from the knife fresh. Then he introduces another character, the proposer's friend, who is so comically evil that he makes the proposer seem like the better person. Like this dude is an Avengers level threat, like someone called Goku, please. The proposer's friend says that teenagers should be hunted like deer by the wealthy because all the deer have already been hunted down. He says that as a plus, the flesh of teenagers is also pretty similar to the deer, so they could hunt them and eat them. But the proposer interjects and says that this idea can't be done, not because it's cruel or anything, but because the meat of young men would be too tough and lean from all the exercise, and the food required to fatten them up would not be worth it. And as for the young women, well, they would soon be breeders who would provide infants for food, so they are off the table. Literally, actually.
Please clap.
He also says that some people might think this is an idea that is bordering upon cruelty. So this dude is perfectly fine in killing literal infants but draws the line at teenagers. The proposer says that this idea was put into his friend's head by the famous Salmanazar. The person he's referring to is George Salmanazar, who was actually a real person. See, he claimed he was from this place called Formosa, modern day Taiwan. He told stories of their cultures and customs, including, you guessed it, cannibalism. And the British believed this, no questions asked. But George Salmanazar was not from Formosa. He was French. He was a fraud, and that too one of the most notorious ones in London. So the actual source for the proposer's friend's cannibalism is a literal grifter. The proposer then says that they don't even have to worry about the poor that are already old because they are every day dying and rotting by cold and famine and filth and vermin as fast as can be reasonably expected. And as for the younger laborers, well, they are just as hopeless as the old ones, as they can't find work anywhere. To the proposer, both were equally as draining to society, and eventually the trash would take itself out. The saddest part about this line is the fact that it is the most realistic one in a modest proposal. See, if you read other projectors, then you actually might find lines like these that say that old and disabled people should be dealt with as they were simply viewed as a drain on society. They actually viewed these people's deaths as a convenient solution to a demographic problem. The proposer then lists out 6 advantages to his cannibalism plan. The first is, of course, the most important one, lessening the number of Catholics, whom he calls our most dangerous enemies. The second is that it would help the poor families pay their landlord's rent. The third is that since these children that are being harvested are Irish, they count as national goods, which means it will technically increase the stock price of the country by £50,000 per annum, which is roughly £10 million in today's society. The fourth is that the proposer says that this will bring a great local custom to their taverns, which might even encourage people from different countries to visit and eat their local babies. You know, I truly wonder what my neighbors are thinking when I shout stuff like this. My rap is so bad, bro. In all seriousness though, 3 and 4 are special because they are a twisted version of Jonathan Swift's actual political beliefs. See, he believed that the reason Ireland was struggling was because they were relying on imported goods from Britain and not using their own local goods. This means that if Britain wanted to, they could literally just stop supplying Ireland with food. But hey, surely nothing will happen 100 years later that will prove this point true. Foreshadowing is a literary device. The fifth reason is that it will promote a healthier family life as mothers would compete to see which one of them could bring the fattest child to the market. And couples that have lots of kids would be spared the pain of actually raising them and could just, earn their 8 shillings every year. The sixth and final advantage of his argument is, in my opinion, the saddest, considering the actual context. It would increase the care and tenderness of mothers towards their children when they were sure of a settlement for life to the poor babes, provided in some sort by the public to their annual profit instead of expense. Men would become as fond of their wives during the time of their pregnancy as they are now of their mares in foal, their cows in calf, or sows when they are ready to farrow, nor offer to beat or kick them, as is too frequent a practice, for fear of miscarriage. What Swift is actually saying here is that mothers would take care of their children better if they knew they were guaranteed money from them, and husbands would not beat their wives, especially during pregnancy, because if they do, they might lose the baby and their 8 shillings. Because people treated their cattle with more care and respect than their own wives and children. Till now, there has been this veil of sarcasm blurring the line between the proposer and Swift. But here he drops the facade for a second to basically scream at his audience. But before that, he spends a little more time making sure that the audience is thoroughly grossed out. The proposer says that the only problem with his plan is all the carcasses that will be lying around. He says that there will be about 20,000 in Dublin, the capital, and 80,000 spread across the country. Again, pulling these numbers out of his ass. The proposer then lists out some foolish alternatives to his idea, before unironically listing out practical, actual solutions to the problem that Irish people were facing, like actually taxing absentee landlords who are a leech on Irish society, actually relying on homegrown goods instead of imported ones, stopping being vain and prideful and spending money on things just to look rich, and God forbid, having mercy on the poor and showing some leniency and learning to come together as a country and a people. But these are all just ruled out because they don't have an immediate profit for the rich. You can almost see Swift frankly admitting how tired he is of all this, getting a sane and practical proposal ignored because they would rather save £3 than a man's life, especially in lines like these. Till he had at least some glimpse of hope that there will ever be some hearty and sincere attempt to put them into practice. But as to myself, having been wearied for many years with offering vain, idle visionary thoughts, and at length utterly despairing of success. Again, I have to remind you before you judge Swift too quickly. The reason he wrote about cannibalism is because he thought that this was the only level of cruelty that would surprise the Protestant elite. But he regains his proposer persona for one final insult against England. I fortunately fell upon this proposal, which, as it is wholly new, so it had something solid and real, of no expense and little trouble, full in our own power, and whereby we can incur no danger in disobliging England. The proposal says that the flesh cannot be exported to a different country, even while salted for preservation. Although he could name a country that would probably eat the country whole anyway. The proposer then asked two questions to anyone who would question his scheme. First, to the Protestant elite and the projectors. How are you going to feed 100,000 starving people using the current broken system? And the second is to the starving families, the people crushed by the landlords. Would you rather have been sold for food at the age of 1 or live the miserable life you are living right now? It's tragic because in 1729 Ireland, you could actually imagine a peasant looking at their life filled with pain and starvation and disease and be like, yeah, I would rather have been eaten as a baby. The final lines of the essay are this. I have no children by which I can propose to get a single penny, the youngest being 9 years old and my wife past childbearing. This line is a final middle finger by turning the proposer into the ultimate hypocrite. He's happy to lead all these children into the slaughter because it will never affect him or his family. The perfect parody of an out-of-touch politician. A modest proposal was faced with obvious backlash. Remember, this proposal was originally sent anonymously. Swift's name was not attached to this, so many people actually thought there was some crazy, powerful, rich dude that wanted to eat their children. There was even a guy named Joshua Allen who came out and publicly denounced a modest proposal and denounced its author because he didn't realize it was satire. Now, Swift saw the reaction of Joshua Allen and thought it was so funny that he became a Kendrick Lamar and relentlessly dissed him in his later poems. However, if you have ever read any of Swift's other works before, you will know that he has a very distinct writing style that's filled with this misanthropy, a hatred of humanity. So it didn't take long for astute readers to link a modest proposal to him. When it was found out that Swift was the one who wrote it, his inner circle, mostly comprising of authors and poets like Alexander Pope, thought it was a masterpiece of satire and congratulated him. But the sad thing is, Swift's true targets, the landlords, the Protestant elites, etc., well, they just kind of shrugged it off after they realized it was satire. They understood what Swift was saying. They knew he was making fun of them, but they literally didn't care. The penal law stood, the landlords continued to tax the poor, Ireland continued relying on imported goods. Nothing changed. A modest proposal was just treated as an annoying stunt that achieved nothing. There is no happy ending here. But hey, let's just be happy that something like a modest proposal isn't real and there isn't a cabal of evil billionaires that allegedly abuse and eat children in the year 2026. Why is the shot not...